Not too long ago, the good people over at PBS Game Show put up a video asking whether non-playable characters can be racist. The answer, of course, is yes, they can be, but not for the reasons outlined in the video. While presenting their argument, the host talks about the virtual census. He mentions how most main characters are straight white dudes, and the only minorities represented in most games are non-playable characters. He argues that this creates a sort of power imbalance, because in games, the game world is designed to serve the player's purpose. And so Jamin goes on to say that video games and their critics need to be aware not only of narrative elements but also of play elements. And this I wholeheartedly agree, especially when it comes to the question of criticism. When someone is critiquing a work, they do have to take into consideration all of the elements that compose said work. Someone making a criticism about a movie will have to take into consideration the narrative of the film, sure, but also the cinematography. Someone making a critical argument about a comic book will likewise have to consider both the text and the image. When it comes to play, specifically in video games, the critic will have to pay attention to the visual aspects, that is, the visual representations and the aesthetics of the game, the narrative which frames play, and play mechanics themselves. Jamin then goes on to disregard this idea and focus only on the visual elements. That is, he ignores play, he ignores narrative, and focuses on visual representations. His first example on why enemy design is problematic is Resident Evil 5, a game set in West Africa, specifically the fictional Kijuju Autonomous Zone, again located in West Africa, and whose population is, not surprisingly, primarily African. Now, Kijuju is a fictional space, but can it be said to be based on a real-life equivalent? To answer this, first we need to ask ourselves, are there any real-life autonomous zones in West Africa? The answer is no. There are certainly a few in Central Africa, but not in West Africa where the Kijuju is supposed to be located. The next best question to ask then would be, is there a place that might resemble an autonomous zone? And to this, I think the answer is yes. If you look at the West African marketplaces, let's say in Lagos, you will find miles and miles of vendors peddling their wares in what appears to be the economic engine of the area. These marketplaces work independent from many of the other sectors, while simultaneously helping to drive the economy of the area. And if you consider the design of Kijuju, it is very much reminiscent of these marketplaces. Of course, I should note this is the perspective of an outsider, as I've never been to one such marketplace. But certainly aerial views, comparisons of architecture, the way in which buildings are constructed, and so on, both in Resident Evil 5 and in documentaries and films created in West Africa and West African markets, are remarkably similar. Regarding the use of spears, well, we have to concede that it is a bit over the top. That being said, there are still many tribes today, like the Maasai and the Samburu in Kenya, which still use spears, the Bushmen in South Africa, and so on. So I guess the question then is Resident Evil 5 racist because there are black people in Africa? The answer is no. Sure, I can see why the author finds it problematic that the game features a white dude in a position of power over minorities, at least minorities from a Western perspective, since in West Africa the minority would be the white dude. But of course it depends on who you select as your main character, doesn't it? The same problem with Warren's argument can be seen in his example of war games set in the Middle East that portray Middle Eastern cultures as the enemy. These games, Battlefield, Call of Duty, and so on, for better or worse, are stories about the Western military engaging in battles in Middle Eastern areas. So if these games want to attempt to imitate reality, as funny as that sounds given how ridiculous some of the play elements are, but if they want to imitate reality at least insofar as visual representations are concerned, then the residents of areas in the Middle East would be people from the Middle East, people with Middle Eastern heritages, and people with Middle Eastern cultures. So no, we cannot say that Battlefield is racist because the player fights in a Middle Eastern place and there are Middle Eastern non-playable characters there as the enemy. That being said, in the case of these games, Battlefield, Call of Duty, and so on, it could be argued that the situation itself, the situation in which Western power goes to a Middle Eastern country for whatever reason, is in itself racially driven. But that's not the argument that Warren was making over at the PBS Game Show. The example that he uses with the Zelda games, I'm not even going to tackle because it's a fictional setting with fictional races. In such cases, you can pretty much read whatever you want into them. So is Zelda racist? Sure, if you want to think that, go ahead. For me, I never gave it a second thought, so it doesn't really matter. Now, one of the arguments that Jamin makes that I have the most contention with is when he talks about Deus Ex, Human Revolution. He talks about Letitia, a street informant, who Jamin mentions is a quote-unquote stereotypical depiction of minorities. Therefore, it follows she is a racist and offensive non-playable character. And yet here's the thing. In real life, there are communities that use the dialect employed by Letitia in the game. This is especially true in poverty-stricken areas of the US. I would go over this in more detail, but ain't nobody got time for that. Now, Jamin says that the character is problematic also because she serves as a sort of gatekeeper for the main character, who cannot go into a given area without her guidance. He suggests then that the non-playable character, Letitia, is in a way subservient to the player character. I would argue that the reverse is true. I'm not sure whether Jamin is familiar with some of the more economically challenged sectors in America, but they are usually very close-knit tribes. Everyone knows each other. And when an outsider goes in uninvited, he or she is not looked at kindly. I know this because I grew up close to one of these places. I grew up near La Perla in Puerto Rico, and if you go in there without someone who lives there, let's just say don't do that. And so what happens in this situation is not that Letitia is subservient to the player character, but rather the player character is dependent on Letitia's goodwill to navigate this area. Jamin then moves on to say that there is some progress being made. He mentions Assassin's Creed Freedom Cry, in which a black character deals with the slave trade. But then ultimately, Jamin argues that slaves are dehumanized because ultimately the ones you liberate end up serving as nothing more than experience. This of course ignores the mechanics of the game while focusing solely on representation and narrative. Liberate a slave and you call it a day. That's it narratively. But why do these liberated slaves give the player experience points? The reason is to encourage the player to free them. It is a form of reward system. Therefore, it is good to free the slaves. And like Jamin very well says, not all non-playable characters need a thorough and expansive story. He then moves on to talk about tokenism and the problem with NPCs being color-swapped version of white characters. He mentions Mass Effect and Dragon Age, in which minority characters, for all purposes, could be white. And he says this as problematic because it doesn't fully represent racial and cultural diversity. But here's the thing, Jamin, you could learn a lot from gender studies. In gender studies, sex doesn't equal gender. The question of whether you are biologically a man or a woman doesn't mean that your gender is man or woman. That's how gender theory is being posited today. Now think about race and culture with that lens in mind. Jamin, just because someone is of a specific race doesn't mean that they have to act in certain, to quote you, quirky ethnic ways. A person, just like an NPC, could be racially white, black, brown, whatever color, meaning they could be of European descent, they could be of African descent, they could be of Hispanic descent, they could be of Native American descent. But culturally, they could be something else entirely. The point that I'm trying to make is that race does not equal culture. Yes, there is, for example, a Hispanic culture. Yes, there is a Latino culture. There's a black culture, and so on. But just because you are Hispanic or Latino or black or white doesn't mean that you have to conform to that culture. It very well may be possible that you were in fact born into a culture not belonging to your race. And Gammon, what we see in the NPCs of Mass Effect and Dragon Age Inquisition is this. We see characters that are racially diverse but not culturally diverse. And is this a problem? Well, it depends on the context. In the case of Dragon Age, a game set in a medieval fantasy world with clearly defined factions, I would say maybe. In the case of Mass Effect, set in a distant future at a moment in time when all of humanity has united, presumably under a single culture, in order to expand into outer space, is it a problem that people of every race adhere to what one can assume has now become just the culture of Earth? In general, I don't see that as a problem. The point that I'm getting at is what Jamin originally stated but then seems to have forgotten. You cannot just look at visual representation, you cannot just consider narrative or story, and you cannot just consider play. You have to look at all three things and see how they play off each other. So that's it for this video. I hope you liked it. Next time around I'll talk about something else. Who knows? Here's the end slate. I will see you next time.